Hello and welcome to a special edition of the D1 Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Rooney, joined by the Nerdmaster General. All due respect, got to go Mark Ethridge first. Big Tex, Kendall J. Rogers, Fitty Barrels, Aaron J. Fitt. And the reason this is a special episode is because we have a special guest. We've got Jay Artigues, the athletic director at Southeastern Louisiana. Jay is a gentleman who's been a Division I head baseball coach and also is the chairman of the NCAA Baseball Selection Committee this year. So Jay has decided to come on here and just give us the 64 teams, 2 weeks. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm going to ask the first question, Jay, and then we're going to get right into this thing. We are so pleased to have you here. You were, as I mentioned, you were a Division I baseball coach, right? 8 seasons at Southeastern. And you've lived this, like you've lived the sleepless selection Sunday night. And so my question is, like, I think I say that out loud because I want the audience to have that background that you're not just some guy on some committee, like you've lived this life. But you had 2 teams in particular, like your 2010 team won 40 games, had an RPI in the low 50s and didn't get in. And then your 2012 team won 39 games and had an RPI in the upper 50s and didn't get in. So again, but you've also seen the strength of the programs in the Southeastern Conference. I think you have a great perspective. Here's my question, Jay. How does your experience as a coach living that affect your role this year as the chairman of the committee?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think coaching definitely helps me because I've been on the other side. And I remember when we didn't get a bid, I was frustrated. We were ranked 17th in the country, got as high as 17th in the country, didn't get a bid. And I was frustrated, but after seeing it and going through it, I got a hell of a lot of respect for the committee. It's a lot. It's tough in there. You got 10 different individuals that are all type A personalities. We're all athletic directors at different universities. So it's really challenging, but I tell you, they do their homework, they do their due diligence, and really try to come up with the best they can with the 64.
Jay, first off, for me, thanks for coming on. The transparency for this is much appreciated. And there are a lot of misconceptions about just what the committee's job is. Could you walk us through the process of what it is and what it isn't as you select the field?
I lost you. I couldn't hear what you said right there. I'm sorry.
So, there are a lot of misconceptions about the committee, what it is, what it isn't. Could you walk us through the process of what you guys go through as you select the field?
Well, throughout the last couple of weeks, we've been having RAC calls, Regional Advisory Committee calls, and they have representatives from each conference around the country. And throughout the six regions, we sit there and we have calls. We listen to everybody's input. They'll rank their regions. As a committee, we take strong consideration with that. And we look through it. There's a lot of work that goes into it. Now with ESPN Plus, it's helped so much, because I'm real big on the eye test. As a former coach, I want to put the best teams in, and that's, to me, that's really important to try to find the best 64. And look, it's a challenge. We know there's going to be at least 8 teams pissed off as the last 4 out, the last 4 that didn't get a bid, a top 8 seed or a top 16. So it's a challenge, but you just got to do your research. I mean, you guys do, and I'm not just blowing smoke. Y'all do such a good job. Y'all make it easy for us. There's so many cheat sheets just following you guys and seeing what's going on with y'all. But I think the eye test as well, watching on ESPN Plus, but even watching in person. I've got to see a lot of teams in person this year. I flew out to LA and watched UC Irvine, and got a hell of a lot of respect for those guys. And, I think that's the biggest thing. But like I said, you got 10 different guys in there, and everybody has different views and different outlooks on things.
Jay, when we go through the Nerdcast, a lot of times we'll get to the end of the bracket and we'll be split on this team or that team. And I'm sure you guys have similar situations as well. What does that deliberation process look like, and how do you eventually reach a conclusion?
It's a really cool experience. This is my 4th year, and seeing how it went down the first year, I had a lot of respect for it. But, we get in that room and we'll fly into Indianapolis. It's really cool. You got TV set up everywhere. You're watching a lot of different conference tournaments go on. We're doing our research before we go in there, but also while we get in there. And, we'll meet, we'll talk about things, then we'll start voting. We'll take a vote, then we'll deliberate for a little while we're doing our work and our research and watching some of the conference games. And then we go back to voting again, so it's just constant. And when you get to the last, it's tough. It's tough when you start talking about the last 4 in, and excuse me, first four out, last four out, and last four in. It gets to be challenging. Obviously, there's 10 of us in there, and you have to have 7 votes to pass to get in. So anytime you got to have 7 out of 10, it's always a big challenge.
Jay, one of the things I was going to ask is you and I were kind of talking about this a couple of weeks ago, but it always seems like fans in general, and in us as like a quartet, we kind of know how the committee typically has to move teams around from a geographic standpoint. But can you kind of explain to fans just the process of why teams sometimes go where they go outside of the number 1 seeds?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was one of the things that kind of opened my eyes when I got in there is how they're placed, geographically. And everybody knows with the NCAA rules with all sports, it's 400 miles. Anything over 400 miles, you fly. So there's a lot of it when they placing you. It's a lot of geographically. We're not ranking all 1 through, like, the worst 64 team doesn't go play the number 1 seed. And that's kind of a misconception from people, and it makes it real challenging. I think one of the biggest challenges is once we go ahead and put the 64 in, getting a 1 seed is not always tough. Getting a 4 seed is not always tough, but that 2 and 3 seed and trying to place them so there's some balance. They do a super job of balancing and trying to make the regionals equal as possible. No matter how good you do, you're always going to have a strongest region and a weakest region, but they go in and we try to really do a good job of matching that and making that as balanced as we can. And look, we know one region is going to be harder than the other. It's just the way it's going to be, but we try to make it as balanced as we can.
Is college baseball, as it continues to make more and more money nationwide, you're seeing coaches' salaries go up, you're seeing more money in NIL, revenue sharing, et cetera, going into these sports. Has there been any discussion with the committee and maybe even seeding like the top 32 teams so that, let's just say, for instance, somebody brought this up in our projections today. We had Dallas Baptist going to Texas. Dallas Baptist is like a borderline, at least in our eyes, is a borderline host, and yet they were sent to Texas as a 2 seed. If you were ranking, let's say, the top 32.
Yeah, one.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, bud.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
No, I understand. I see what you're saying on that, and that hasn't been yet. Well, I shouldn't say it has, but we have discussed that. We're not at that point yet. But one of the things to try to do also is not send the same team to the back-to-back regional same place. For instance, right here, if Southern or Baton Rouge wins the SWAC, we don't want to send them to LSU every single year. We'll try to space out. If they go to LSU this year, then following year they go somewhere else. Just use that example because they're right around me. So we do our best to try to do that as well, because you also want to reward the kids that are playing. They don't want, for instance, some youth softball, for example, our girls win the conference championship, but they riding 45 minutes down the road to play at LSU. Those girls would much rather go to Arkansas, Florida State, or somewhere else. So some of that is taken consideration, but geographically plays a role in it for sure.
I want to go back to something you said, Coach, a few minutes ago about I thought it was interesting. You're talking about, you got 10 voters and you need 7 votes to get in, which I hadn't heard it necessarily expressed that way before. But here's what I want to get into is when you've got a situation where you're trying to evaluate 2 different teams, and we do this on our show every week, where it's like, it comes down to, Cal Poly versus Xavier for the last spot, right? I mean, like, it's hard to break down one team without talking about the other. And let's say I'm the AD at Xavier. Do I have to leave the room for this entire discussion? Or how can you evaluate teams in a vacuum without comparing them against the other teams?
Yeah, well, I think you have to compare them against other teams. But if, like, for instance, the Southeastern Louisiana is on the board and they're discussing it, I have to leave the room. We can't be in the room when they're discussing you at all, whether you're talking about on the bracket play, getting in, or anything. If your school is being discussed, you completely have to leave the room. And that's something I didn't know until I got in there, obviously, which I like that, because it's challenging. If somebody's next to me and I know their school's in it, it's hard to discuss them. So they have to leave the room. But that's the big challenge, and RPI can be a tricky thing. And as a coach, I don't believe in going straight by RPI. Never done that before in my life. You look at the Big East, UConn and Creighton. UConn's got a 40 RPI, Creighton's got a 56 RPI. Creighton's number 1 in the league right now. UConn's number 2. Creighton beat them 2 out of 3. So do you put a team that's 16 points lower than the other, or do you put the team that beat them head to head? So there's different criteria and different things you have to look at, So if you damn if you do, you damn if you don't. But you got to look at what you think's best and put the best team in.
So I want to follow up again because this is something that we talk about a lot, and I'm sure as a committee member, it's something that you probably don't like hearing us talk about, but it is as Mark wrote last year, and I thought in his excellent column reacting to the field, it's the perception of impropriety or favoritism or thumbs on the scale, and here's the thing: is it's this is not, we say this every year because it doesn't matter who's on the committee. It happens every year. But I mean, last year, as an example, there were, 7 of the 10 people on the committee had a team that was kind of on a cut line, right? I mean, you had Florida State got that last top 8 seed. You had East Carolina got that last host. You had Florida, Kansas State, Coastal, Indiana, all bubble teams. They all had cases. None of them were like egregious, but all of them got in, and that happens every year. And I understand, like, if you're the AD at Southeastern and you leave the room when they talk about Southeastern, what happens when you come back in? They're talking about UTRGV, and well, somebody says, "Hey, wait, they lost 2 out of 3 to Southeastern." Do you have to like get up and get back out of the room? I just don't understand how these safeguards can possibly really work, especially when you look at the historical, just the facts of going back 20 years. I mean, the teams that have representation on the committee almost always fare better.
I lost you for a minute, so I didn't hear the very last few things. I did hear you say we beat UTRGV 2 out of 3, which so you did your homework. I heard that part. But it's a challenge. Last year, like I said, last year was my 3rd year on it. We had 7 teams, 7 ADs whose school was in it, and that's a rarity to have that many. But at the same time, it is challenging. But to me, it's the best way to do it. But I do think leaving the room helps, but it just so happened last year, man, that was a challenge having that many in there. It'd be nice if all 10, I mean, I want us to be in the tournament, don't get me wrong, but if you had 10 teams and they won it, it'd be a little bit easier. But at the same time, you got some good ADs in there. They do a tremendous job. Got a lot of respect for them, and they're all fighting to put the best teams in. Trust me, they do their homework, and look, I know perception and how it looks a lot of times because no matter what, like I was using a UConn and Creighton, for example, there's going to be some people upset and didn't get in.
Jay, for me, I mean, the sport has certainly changed the last few years, and there's been a consolidation of a lot of the talent heading into the larger conferences, and also the conferences are just getting bigger in general. How do you evaluate that? Because you look at it, Iowa, for example's only played a few teams that are going to make the field, while an SEC team might have 30 games, right? So how do you do that evaluation? Because the schedules are so dissimilar.
I mean, that's the big challenge right there. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Do you put a Southeastern Louisiana in there who won their league, had a great season, or do you put the 14th place SEC team? That's always the challenge, and that's going to be the challenge every year. And I think that's what kind of makes it. That's why we all have jobs doing this. That's why you guys do so well in this, because it's always going to be a discussion about that. Because it's not going to be black and white. It's not going to be this is the way it should be. It's going to be a discussion every single year. And, again, the eye test to me, but use Iowa and Southeastern, we don't play each other. So comparing those two, it's a big challenge because you have no common opponents. It makes it a big challenge. But that's why I think you get 10 different guys from different areas around the country.
Yeah. Just to kind of a follow-up, the larger conferences have created unbalanced schedules because you don't play everybody. And in the past, we've had these historical trends, not really a set guideline, but you kind of know if you have this RPI range, this conference record, you're probably going to be okay. Now, I don't know that should carry as much weight because of how unbalanced the schedules are. How's the committee going to view that this year in the first year? Because you're kind of setting a precedent with what you do.
Yeah, that was a big discussion in the RAC call this week, as well as our committee call today. That was a big discussion because it makes it more challenging. If you don't play Texas or LSU compared to playing the bottom 2 teams at SEC, that's a big difference. So that's just that just makes our job a little bit harder. I mean, it's not one way to say this is how it needs to be done, but we talked about strength of schedule within the conference as well. So if you take your conference schedule, strength of schedule, I know it gets complicated as hell, but I think that's the only way you can do it and look at you got to take in consideration who they did play and who they didn't play. You look at Sun Belt right now. You got some good teams in the Sun Belt. Southern Miss and Coastal and Troy. Coastal and Southern Miss didn't play this year. And that's 2 of the top teams in there. So that comes in effect for sure.
Jay, one thing I was going to ask about is, where do you kind of stand? And I know you're not speaking for the whole committee here, but where do you kind of stand as a chairman on, as a coach who is at a mid-major, where do you stand on, teams like Xavier and Cal Poly who went out in non-conference and maybe they didn't win a lot of these games, but they actually went out as mid-majors and challenged themselves in a pretty substantial way. How do you, like, in your personal opinion, how do you kind of value those teams? And also, do they get a lot of credit for that? Or is it one of those things where, hey, they need to be winning a lot of these games too?
I think that's a great point. I think the intent to schedule is important. So, and I'm not knocking any programs, but let's just say you schedule a Arkansas, thinking they're going to be one of the best teams in the league, as they always are, and they had that one down year where they 14th in the SEC. You tried to schedule a tough, challenging team. Just so happened that year they were down. So I think the intent to schedule means a lot. What you're saying, that definitely does come into play, and that's discussed in that room a good bit.
Hey, Jay, can I ask a follow-up on that intent to schedule part? Like, do you guys, I feel I'm hearing more and more coaches will say, because, scheduling's tricky where it's not like ordering salsa on a menu, right? Like, hey, I'll take a mild schedule, I'll take a spicy schedule. It's, scheduling's hard. And I hear a lot of coaches saying, I had this really good weekend lined up, and then they banged me at the last second, and now I'm just scrambling to get 3 games, period. I would imagine, like, can they communicate that to you guys, or is that just like the luck of the draw? I don't know. Like that, if I was a coach and that happened to me, I would be really frustrated.
It is communicated. We hear a lot like this time of year, somebody has to cancel for whatever reason. I've had calls, coaches call, hey, we're canceling because it's severe weather coming through or transportation problems, or the other team had to cancel for different reasons. That's communicated, and that is taken consideration, because you don't want teams to cancel because of RPI. And several years ago, that was happening a lot. But that's been frowned upon big time amongst the committee, and you don't see it happen nearly as much. But I like the fact that there's a lot of communicating going on right now. Before we meet, we'll get bullet points from most of the conferences send it, talking about their teams, and we'll have schools do the same thing. And I like that, encourage them. I want as much information as we could possibly get. I'm trying to be as transparent as I can with everything, maybe too transparent at times. But I think you can't over communicate it. I want to get the word out about everybody so we can see every different angle of it. And that's definitely helped people explaining why they had to cancel games late in the year.
So to kind of follow up on that, I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about Virginia this year as a team that needs RPI help and would have gotten most likely RPI help if they had been able to play their scheduled series in Tallahassee, which of course was canceled for unforeseeable, tragic circumstances. If they'd won even one game there, they're 10 spots higher in the RPI right now. So that's something that the committee will take into consideration. And how do you kind of compare that versus a team that just got unlucky with weather?
Yeah, 100%. We actually discussed that today. Virginia, it wasn't anything. It was just completely out of their control. They couldn't go down and play in Tallahassee against Florida State. And it definitely hurt them in RPI, but we take that in consideration. We know that. So that's completely out of their control. But if you remember a few years ago, you had teams canceled in the year just because they're playing a team with 200 RPI and they just didn't want to play that game. That's completely different, and all that's discussed in there.
Jay, when we were going through our latest Nerdcast, trying to come up with a bracket, we had a lot of trouble trying to decide between the SEC teams that have really high RPI, but maybe are down a little lower in the schedule, like 4th to 6th, versus teams that are doing better in the standings and in our poll as well, but their RPI isn't as strong. Traditionally, RPI has been kind of king. I'm not sure if with the unbalanced schedules, how does that matter anymore? I'd love to get your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I think you make a great point with unbalanced schedule. It kind of skews RPI a little bit. I've never been just a big RPI guy. Obviously, we use that. It's a tool, but I agree with you. The conference standards, if you come in second place in the conference and the team is 6 has RPI 20 points ahead of you, to me, that standards means more in my opinion, as a former coach. So the unbalanced scheduling within conference makes that even more challenging with RPI for sure. And I kept using that for example. Like we won our league, but we don't have the highest RPI. but we win a league. So that's something to me. Winning your league, finishing ahead of teams, head to head, that's the most important thing in my opinion. But everybody's a little bit different.
Right.
So even with the unbalanced conference schedules, winning a conference championship in the regular season still carries a lot of weight with this committee.
Well, it depends. Like I said, you got some conferences, like our conference, we play everybody. SEC doesn't. So
Sure.
I think every conference is a little bit different. It may not carry as much weight in a conference that doesn't play everybody compared to one that does.
That makes
But
sense.
and when you do, the head to heads, to me, really important. It'd be hard for me to sit there and justify putting a team in over a team that you swept them that way. You swept them throughout the season. And y'all were real comparable in other categories. So head to head is really important in my book.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to ask about, Jay, is from your perspective, and I guess you could speak for the whole committee here, but when you guys are in the room, and I know you rely heavily on the regional advisory committees in these different regions, but where does like the eyeball test kind of fall into play here? Obviously, you're looking at a lot of in-depth metrics. You're looking at KPI, you're looking at RPI, you're looking at where the RAC is ranking teams. But from your perspective, let's throw out a team, for instance, this year, such as Texas A&M, that's really hard to figure out. Preseason number one, they've got as high in series wins as you can imagine, but also they just got swept by Missouri. So, I mean, is there an eyeball test component there that weighs pretty heavily for you, or not really?
Very much, yes. And we talked about that today. Mike Alfred actually brought it up. Watch games on ESPN Plus. Talking about the committee, watch as many as you can. I like watching them in person. Like I said, I flew out to LA and watched UC Irvine. I've seen Mississippi State play. I've seen LSU play. I've seen a boatload of teams play in person because to me it means a lot. The eyeball test is really important. You go back to last year, Florida. Does Florida deserve to get in? Do they not deserve to get in? I remember going down, driving and watching Florida play. And I'm like, they're definitely one of the best 64 teams in the country. So it would be hard for me to keep them out. So the eyeball test had a lot to do with my opinion on that, at least. But I think eyeball test means a heck of a lot, especially now that you have opportunities to watch them all. If you're not watching games these days, shame on you because you can see almost everybody play.
I guess just a quick follow-up on that. I know we're getting close to wrapping here, but how much of the mission here is to pick the 64 best teams that are most capable of making a deep run versus the 64 quote unquote most deserving teams that have had the best season relative maybe to their conference or their peers or whatever?
Well, you just asked $1 million question. I mean, that's what it boils down to every year. To me, I like to put the best 64 teams in my opinion. Sometimes that is the most deserving, sometimes it's not. But everybody's different. Some people don't want to reward a team that's 13th in that league. But you remember Ole Miss a few years ago, they weren't very high in that league, but they're national champs. So that's the challenge every single year, man. There's some smaller schools that are deserving, had great teams. Use Lamar last year. Man, that's a dang good club. And not, in my opinion, they were one of the best 64 teams. They didn't get in. Doesn't mean they weren't deserving of getting in. I'm just using that one for example. They're good, so that's the challenge every single year. Do you put a Florida over a Lamar, like last year? That's the $1 million question every single year.
Jay, one thing I was going to ask real quick. I think you might have cut out, but what is like one thing about the selection process or just the committee schedule, things like that tied to the postseason that you kind of want fans to know about that fans don't know anything about?
I think the biggest thing is placement. Like I'll get people text and email me and fussing at me because their team had to go all the way out to Oregon or their team had to go to LSU. A lot of that's out of the control. A lot of that is done geographically, because we can't afford to fly, 36 teams around the country. You can't afford to do that. So that comes into play, and that's the biggest challenge. And every year I've had schools, ADs call me, I can't believe y'all sent us here. That's a tough region. The geographics comes into play when it comes to placement sometimes. And I think that's important for people to know, because I didn't know that until I first went into that room, because to me, I want to put the worst 64 with the best first. I think number one seed deserves that, but I think that's the biggest thing. And I think when new committee members come in, that's the biggest eye opener for them.
One more for me, and I guess we're running out of time, but we could do this all day. One thing I'd like to know about is, the RPI has been such an important tool for past committees. Last year, the KPI was introduced. So that to me shows that there's at least an acceptance to look at other tools. How much do you guys still rely on the RPI versus the KPI? And do you sense a willingness to look at more tools? Because there are times when we've all looked at the RPI and go, that is not the number 20 team in the country or whatever. So where do we stand there?
Yes, and that's a great point because we discussed that today in our fall meeting. We're going to discuss another metric to bring into the fold. And you probably know which one I'm talking about.
Yep.
Because I think the more comparisons you have, if you have a team, let's just say 10 RPI, but they 32 in KPI. Sometimes you've had big discrepancies.
Yes.
Then that brings a better discussion to the table. And I think if we bring in the other one, a third party to come in, that makes it even better. So that's going to be discussed in the fall. But I like as many comparisons as possible for sure.
Love that. Love it.
Hey, Jay, final question. So let's say you guys are down to 63 teams. You got one spot left, and you've got 4 teams. No, I'm not going to mention any team names, and no athletic director has to leave the room. I'm just curious on the process. So, like, you have one spot left, and you have 4 teams that you guys are considering. You mentioned 7 out of 10 votes. I'm just having a tough time picturing that. Does each of the 10 members vote on each of those 4 teams, or how do you guys go from 4 to 1?
Great question. So what they'll do is they'll have all 4. We all have big screens in front of us. All 4 will be on our screen, and we'll vote on them. If you don't get it all, then we do a ranked vote, and then we'll start eliminating the team. Because if you can't come to a consensus, then we'll eliminate a team. So then it'll be down to 3, and then we'll do the same thing until we finally get to that 1. So, because you're right, to get 7 sometimes a challenge. So sometimes we'll have to do a ranked vote to get to the final 2, and then that's when we'll vote to get to 7 out of 10.
Gotcha.
So all those
votes and then ranked votes. Go ahead, Fitzy. Sorry.
And all those votes are anonymous. It's not like you're raising your hand.
Correct. Sometimes I try to peep and see what they vote. I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's anonymous. I mean, it's a really cool setup, man. If y'all haven't seen the room, it's a really neat setup in there. Like a hell of a
send pictures this year. Yeah.
Couple of CELA flags on the wall and stuff.
Yeah.
All right, if they let us send a picture, I'll sneak a picture and send y'all a picture.
Yeah, you're gonna have like you're gonna have like your old school trapper keeper filled with CELA notes.
Subliminal messages to the committee. I love it. Fight songs playing on phones. That's great.
Hey Jay, line up.
That's right. We really appreciate this, Jay, and I want to speak for the group. What you said about having respect for the committee, this is an impossible job, like literally impossible. As the sport grows, the job gets harder, actually. And Mission Impossible just keeps getting harder. But our committee is full of really good people that care about the sport. Like, we've got really good baseball ADs on this committee. So we know that you guys are going to give us an incredible effort. And what you said is true. Like, no matter what you do, there's going to be hurt feelings, and we all get that. But yeah, we have great confidence in your committee, and I guess we want to wish you the best of luck because it's a tough gig.
Yeah, thank y'all. And look, anytime you want me on, I love to come on. So thanks a bunch. Appreciate it.
And thanks again for being such a great sport. We lob plenty of grenades at the committee.
Oh, yeah.
We know that. So for you to come on and answer our questions is I think it's telling and it reflects well on you. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank y'all. Appreciate it, guys. I'll see y'all up there in Omaha.
Very cool.